few more minutes as we'll wait to see if a few more come into the Zoom. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We are so excited to have you all this morning. Just a few reminders before we get started. If we could all just please keep ourselves muted throughout today's presentation, that would be awesome. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the Zoom chat function or wait till the end till when we open it up for questions. Let's see what else. If you are joining us over Facebook Live today, welcome to you as well. If you have any questions, you can use the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments, and we'll cover those at the end of the tour as well. This tour is being recorded and live streamed and will be posted on our social media channels once the tour is over. If you'd like to rewatch the tour or other tours put on by the museum, please check our Facebook page for those. So without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome Karen, who will be presenting on French Neoclassicism to Impressionism. So I will turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Haley. I want to preface the talk by letting my viewers know I have a pretty bad case of COVID. And of course, you won't get exposed because we're doing this on Zoom. But if I seem a little, well, not my usual self, it might be because of the COVID. But hopefully, I'll do a credible job. And it's a very important topic. You know, 19th century French art really affected art in Europe, in America. And, you know, you might wonder, why am I stopping at Impressionism? But the reason is post-Impressionism, when you think of the work of Van Gogh, for example, that Seurat, Gauguin, and Cezanne, it's exploring modern art. And not to say that some of the paintings we're going to look at today don't begin to reach the realm of modern art. If you think of Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, for example, really brings us into the beginning of modern art. It's just too overwhelming of a topic. So I decided to leave the post-impressionists for the next lecture. And so it'll be sort of a continuum of the first 3/4 of what's happening in the 19th century in France, and then the last quarter. I think people are really intrigued by France in the 19th century, and particularly, of course, Impressionism, and maybe its predecessor, the Barbizon painters, because there's something so refreshing and beautiful to look at the plein air paintings of the Impressionists, like Monet and Pissarro, and also to look at the interesting cafe scenes of Degas. So Impressionism is really, it's always been a very popular art movement to many viewers. But let's just kind of go back to the beginning of the 19th century. And I want to preface it by telling you a few things that are happening. First of all, something that's very important to what happens in France is the Enlightenment. And that's a European, it's called the Age of Reason. It's a European intellectual movement with ideas about God and reason and nature and humanity. And they were synthesized. And so there was this philosophy of enrichment and growth that many philosophers and writers like John Locke, Sir Isaac Newton, and Voltaire were exploring. So that sort of is a very important factor. Another thing that I just want to go over a little bit with you are the École des Beaux-Arts. So many of the artists we're looking at would train in these schools and later called academies that were sponsored by the French government. And they were very prestigious, and many of the artists we're talking about were enrolled in these École des Beaux-Arts, these academies or these art schools. And along those lines, too, we have the salon. And the salon was from 1673 to the present, were at that time held in the Louvre once a year, and they were where the great artists were hoped to be accepted and exhibited for public viewing. It wasn't really until about the 1874 Salon de Refusé that we're going to see how the Impressionists departed from this salon when they weren't accepted or they wanted to show kind of a different kind of art. The third component, aside from those things I just mentioned, is the series of revolutions that occur in France. And as you know, it altered the whole system of government and who was in charge. And it began, the first series of revolutions began in 1789 to 1799, where Louis XVI was guillotined and disposed, along with Marie Antoinette. Again, we have another revolution, and I will explain a little bit more when we get to paintings that reveal information about these revolutions. 1830 was another revolution which helped propel realism in art. And then 1848, which helped propel the Barbizon and Impressionist artists. So the revolutions were very important. With that said, I want to say that art in France beginning at the end of the 18th century was developed along the axis of revolution. And so Louis XVI controlled the academy, what was maintained at that time under Louis, the Rococo style, a very light and sort of frivolous manner of art. We do actually have some masterpieces in the Timken, particularly François Boucher and our Fragonard, which reflect Rococo style. But this is moving away from Rococo, the 19th century, and going to the time of isms, ISMS. And what do I mean by the time of isms? Because we have Neoclassicism, which I'll show you in a moment. We have Romanticism, realism, the Barbizon, sort of a subcategory of Impressionism. And then, of course, we have post-Impressionism. So the isms sort of dictate the names and styles of these painters. So when we go to each type of painting, I will indicate what style it is, and we can talk a little bit more in depth about how it reflects that ism. All right, so the great Jacques-Louis David, probably the most important artist of the 19th century in France. And remember, France is dictating a lot of what's going on in the rest of Europe, and then later, of course, in the United States. But Thomas Jefferson, when he came to France, he not only enjoyed wine, but he looked at architecture and looked at art, and he was very much influenced by neoclassical architecture. So this is a painting, but let's just talk a little bit about the stylistic concerns of realism. It was it was inspired by the discovery of ancient Greco-Roman ruins in Europe. For example, the archaeological unveiling of Herculaneum in Pompeii, for example. The style had clarity, focus, somber form, shallow space, strong horizontal and vertical lines. There was harmony, there was clarity, there was restraint, sort of universality, and it moved away from the frivolity of the Rococo. Now, I'm going to show you some stylistic aspects of this, but I will talk a little bit more about Jacques-Louis David in a moment. If you can look at this painting, The Oath of Heratai, very important painting, it's very much on what we call the post and lentil basis. It is not on the diagonal. When we look at the Romantic period of art, you will see a lot of use of diagonal and much more extreme use of color and brushstroke. But you can see this is a very restrained painting. Now, let's talk specifically about Jacques-Louis David. He came from a bourgeois family. I believe he was born in Paris. I could be wrong, but his family was pretty wealthy. But his father was killed in a duel when he was 9. So he was kind of left to some relatives who tried to inspire him because he was a very gifted artist. He also had a facial abnormality that made speaking a little difficult. I think it translated into a bit of a speech impediment. So in many ways, he probably felt that he was held back because he was he was up for the Prix de Rome when he was a strong student, and he kept getting denied. Finally, after 4 years, he did get the Prix de Rome, but he should have gotten it probably the first time. With whom did he study? He studied at first with Boucher. Ironically enough, Boucher was this great Rococo painter on the wane, because he was quite elderly at the time, and everybody said, well, you can train with him. And then he went to Boucher's studio, and after a short period of time, Boucher said, I don't think this is working. So let's have you go with Vien, this man, Joseph Vien, who was a historical painter, the best historical painter, but suffice to say that he did train as a historical painter. So let's go on. Really quickly, though, Jacques-Louis David actually worked as a Jacobean revolutionary, and he would have surely been beheaded if not the fact that he was such a brilliant artist and Napoleon let him off. So Jacques-Louis David could have been guillotined very easily because he was a very prominent revolutionary. Okay, let's go to the first painting. The Oath of Horatii is kind of reflective of what's happening. This is pre-First Revolution, French Revolution, but things are stirring up in France. And what Jacques-Louis David is trying to explain, that we should have allegiance to our state, not to the clergy and really not to the royal family, but we owe it to our state. So this comes from the history of Livy, L-I-V-Y, in the 17th century Roman writer, and he talks about this oath. And what happened was, this is a very interesting story. Rome and Alba Longa were fighting, and Rome was represented by the Horatii right here, Alba Longa by the Curiatii on Alba Longa. And this is kind of a brilliant idea. They decided, instead of battling with massive amounts of young people, with hundreds, if not thousands of people dying, let's take our three prominent sons from each side and let them do battle. So here we have the father of the Horatii offering the swords to his children, three sons, that is, and saying, be strong, go to battle. And you don't see any emotion, really. You see stalwart sacrifice. And they stand in rigid, formal posture. But look at the opposite end. You see quickly the Doric capitals and the arches, that's Roman and Greek combined. And then we have these sobbing women. Well, the sobbing women represent Curiatii, and Curitas and Horatus. She, the woman on the right in the white cream dress, is a Horatus who is engaged to a Curitas. And she is weeping because she knows either her brothers will die or her fiance will die. And the woman in the brown is Curitas, and she's doing the same thing. And then there's a nanny governess holding the children. What happens in the battle is that all the Curiatii die, and one survivor of the Horatii. So they win, and he does this by separating the three soldiers on the other side. They run in different directions, and he kills each one of them. Well, when his sister finds out, the one who's weeping, the first one, he kills her too. Pretty gruesome. And what he's saying is, you're sacrificed for the good of the state, and you are showing weakness, and I don't go along with that. So I'm going to kill you. Very horrible. Well, I could talk about this painting for quite a while because this is one of his magnificent paintings, but I'm going to go on and show you another painting by Jacques-Louis David. And this is a magnificent work of art. And I want to say that I was really privileged to finally see this painting a couple months ago when I was in Brussels. I'd never seen the painting. I've been in Belgium a few times, but I'd never actually been able to go to see the painting. And it's magnificent. It's huge. It's beautiful. And it's one of his it's actually my favorite work by Jacques-Louis David. Okay, so the death of Marat, as you can see, occurs during the time of the French Revolution. What is the painting about? Well, there was a woman named Charlotte Corday who was a minor, weakened aristocrat, financially weakened aristocrat, and she was worried about what Jean Marat, who was a great friend of best friends with Jacques-Louis David, was promoting, because he was a publisher, he was a radical, Jacobean, very radical. And she was worried about that he would cause a revolution. We did have a revolution. So she comes in the guise of a story she wants to tell him. And I don't know if my cursor, hopefully you can see it. There's a letter of introduction. You can even see her name Courbet right there. And then we have a couple other things. There's a knife, and you can see the flesh wound where he bleeds quickly. He dies very rapidly. Another thing that's really interesting is he's lying in a bath. Why? He was actually a doctor. Originally, he was a doctor, but he had a chronic skin condition like eczema or something like that. And so he often wrote and greeted people in this covered bath. And so she was able to corner him. So you have the ink well and the quill of a writer, and then the knife. Now think about this. What does this remind you of? This is like a Catholic saint or Jesus. This is like the entombment of Jesus. So he's likening what is happening to Marat as a sacrifice, as in the sacrifice of Jesus. What is happening, I just want to mention, so this is 1793. By 1793, the violence in the revolution was pretty extreme. And it was either 1792 or 1793 that Louis XVI, Louis XVI and his Marie Antoinette were captured at the border trying to escape, and they were guillotined. And just really quickly, I'm sure you all know this, but the guillotine was developed by Dr. Guillotine because they were killing so many royals that they needed a more humane way of doing it. And also, eventually, some of the revolutionaries were killed too. So this is a beautiful showing sacrifice and how an opponent killed the great Marat. I'm going to move on. And I do want to talk about another Jacques-Louis David that happens to be in our Timken Museum. And I want to show you a portrait, of course. This was done after the revolution. An interesting story is that I sort of mentioned it earlier. Jacques-Louis David was would have been murdered because of his revolutionary involvement with the Jacobians. But as I said, Napoleon thought this guy is really good, like probably the best artist around. I want to keep him. I want him to paint moi, or paint me. So he was exiled first at the Louvre, or I think there was some jail in the Louvre or something, or one of the palaces, maybe not the Louvre, the palace. And then he eventually went to Brussels. And that's why you see that painting was in Brussels, but he also was in England for a while too. This is Cooper Penrose. He commissioned Jacques-Louis David, paid him a great amount of money to have this portrait done because he knew that Jacques-Louis David was such a great artist. And he was a timber merchant, Irish. He was living in Ireland. He built this gorgeous manor home and wanted to fill it with all manner of exquisite furniture, paintings, artifacts. So he commissions Jacques-Louis David, but he's a Quaker. And so therefore, he's not going to show a lot of attributes in the painting. And you know what an attribute would be showing? Let's say if you're a tennis player, there's a racket, or an artist, a palette, but he shows no attributes. And if you notice, Jacques-Louis David puts this triangular formation at a lower point in the painting. And it's a very shallow space. That's part of Neoclassicism too, that shallow space. But he doesn't want to show this huge, overwhelming filling of the space kind of form, because it would actually give it sort of a grandiose aspect. And he did not, Penrose did not want his, Quaker brethren to think he was a man of, too high-born tastes, even though he had them. Just really quickly, you can see the beautiful hands. I always talk about the hands and the face. They're just magnificently rendered. He wears an exquisite linen, fresh linen garment. And then we have this beautiful jacket with the buttons. So it's a really wonderful portrait. And of course, you can see it at our very own Timken Museum. Now, I'm going to depart and come back to Neoclassicism a little bit, because the artist I will show you after Gericault is considered kind of on the cusp of both, and we'll explain that in just a minute. Okay, wow, look at this, they're after the Medusa. Before I talked about that, let me just briefly tell you that Romanticism, which begins with Gericault in the very, the first 15 years of the 19th century, Romanticism was all over literature, and we have people like Victor Hugo and Chateaubriand from a little bit earlier, and who's a diplomat, just writers, Garnier, architect, in France. But there's, the Romantic movement was really profoundly interesting in this time period. It was very subjective, it was imaginative, loved nature and emotion and exotic information coming from the Middle East and parts of Asia. So it's quite different than neoclassicism. And remember, I told you that post-Enlightenment system of classicism, this is all on the diagonal. It's emotional, it's charged, it's violent, but it does stem from a totally different perspective. So this is the work of Theodore Gericault, which unfortunately, sad to say, he died very young. I believe he was 32. He died of bad lungs, and also he had a number of writing accidents. He showed early promise as a young man. He actually studied with Carl Vernet, who was the son of Claude Joseph Vernet. We have a beautiful seaport at sunset in the Timken. I might have a seaport at sunset from 1749, which is a magnificent masterpiece in our French gallery, but you can see that. But that was the father of this great master who trained Gericault. So Gericault was fascinated with, he went to Italy, he loved the work of Michelangelo, he loved horses. He would often go to look at horses. He was in the military, but unfortunately, some of his writing accidents didn't help his health. So, as I say, he died young, but very influential painter. The Wrath of Medusa actually comes from something that actually occurred. So, this was done in 1819. In 1817, I'm sorry, a horrible tragedy occurred, and that was all over the papers. The Medusa was a raft, a frigate, and it crashed off the coast of Mauritania because the ancien regime or ancient regime captain had sailed because of the revolution for decades, rusty at his job, decides to be the captain of the ship, and he grounds the ship. Now, it's a little confusing. It said that 150 people tried to get on these life rafts. I'm not sure how that was possible. I'm not sure if 150 people were actually on the boat and only a certain amount got on this life raft. But suffice to say, only 15 of more than 150 men survived. And you can see the survivors, three of them here waiting, please help, get us help. And you can see very small distant, you can see a little ship right there that they're waving to, pretty hopeless. And then we have a torn mast and sail. And then this configuration that's gruesome. So we have, I'm sorry to show this, but a torso. Why? Cannibalism. The only way these men survive for days and days and days and days is to eat each other. And so this man here, just frozen in grief, holds the body of his lifeless son, and he's just trying to fend off cannibalism. So this had a very, so it shows what a lot of what Romanticism describes is the fight with nature, man being overcome by nature. Think about J.M.W. Turner in England, how man is overcome by nature. And here we have that right here with the waves about to crash. So it's on the diagonal, vivid colors. When this was first shown, wow, people were really kind of shocked. One last thing I want to say about Gericault, he did a wonderful series. There was some madness in his family, maybe even himself a little bit. And so one of his last series was of people in an insane asylum. He did a lot of beautiful sketches, very stark and interesting sketches, because a doctor friend was a psychiatrist working with people with madness. So it's something to look up. Okay, so I'm going to move on because as I always do, I run late. Let's look at the work now. I want to kind of tell you that I'm segueing a little bit because some people think Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres was one of the greatest proponents of neoclassicism, and he was. In fact, he dropped out of school young. Where he used to study was the Louvre. Remember, Napoleon is bringing back a lot of stolen artifacts, paintings from other countries, like from Italy and Spain. He's bringing from his campaigns, and so they go to the Louvre and people get to study there. So Ingres was interested in the line, and he didn't like a lot of his teachers, and I don't know if he actually did study at the Academy or Beaux-Arts, but he did like to go to the Louvre and just copy, copy, copy. He loved the great works of Belgian artists, Dutch artists, Spanish artists. He was interested in line and pure color. He was so dogmatic about classicism, he rejected some of his students who began to go toward Romanticism. But it's funny, this is a Romantic painting. So that's why I kind of started with Neoclassicism, went a little bit to Romanticism, we'll go back to Romanticism, but this is a Romantic painting, the Grand Odalisque. So if you know the work of Titian and Venus of Urbino, for example, these beautiful odalisques, these concubines, are definitely inspired by the 17th, by Venetian painting. So she's a concubine for a harem, and look at her, she's so oddly anatomically drawn. You could think of the Mannerist painter Parmigianino, for example, Madonna with a long neck, although she's opposite of Madonna. Her proportions are anatomically odd. When they first looked at it, somebody said, she doesn't even look like she has blood, bones, what? But she's beautiful at the same time. Now, anatomically, there's so many, this arm is much longer than this arm. She probably has 3 extra vertebrae in her spine, 3 to 5. Some people say 3, some say 5. And there's a sort of a little bit of a, what's the word? I'm sorry, a little inappropriate comment I'm going to make, but it's true. They were saying that part of this is that because the sultans wanted sensual women as concubines, they wanted them to have a lot of body, a long body like that for pleasure. So that might be part of it. But just look at her beautiful face, shows no emotion, the jewelry, the hyper luxury of her surroundings, looks like fur, a peacock fan, and these beautiful peacocks in the satin. But so this really goes to both Romanticism and Neoclassicism. Oh, by the way, it was Napoleon's sister who actually commissioned Ingres to paint this. So if you look at Titian's work and some of the others, also Jacques-Louis David's Madame Récamier, that was also probably an inspiration. So I'm going to move on. And to show you that he was kind of grounded in Neoclassicism, we see the apotheosis of Homer. And the apotheosis of Homer was one of his grand paintings. It was commissioned by Charles X to hang in the Louvre, to show the strength of the Bourbon monarchy. And we have all these greats here. And I don't have time to go over all of them, but let me just, first of all, this is a wonderful, iconic, a very iconic Greek temple. And we have Victory personified, who is crowning Homer. And we have the Ionic capitals here. And it's a perfect Greek temple. At the feet of Homer, the great poet, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the basis of ancient Greek literature, is at his feet. Can't really see it. And then we have all manner of greats. Now, he puts the ancients like Sappho, Herodotus, and all more at the top. And then more of the contemporaries like Voltaire and Poussin, painters and writers and thinkers, and Michelangelo right here. But right here, I'll show you Raphael. And he's being led by, who is he being led by? He's being led by Apollos. And here's Apollos from ancient Greece leading the great Raphael, who we revered. And just a magnificent homage to this great writer, Homer. So the apotheosis of Homer. Now, we've got to go to the Revolution, and we have to go to the great Eugene Delacroix. So Eugene Delacroix lived to be about 65. He was a French Romantic painter. He was considered the leader of the movement, very great colorist. He developed such a great manner of using color that the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were very inspired by him. He loved to look at historical painting. He kept historical painting kind of fresh in his mind. He liked to visit exotic places like Morocco. You'll see that in the next painting. And he did exhibit at the Paris Salon. He was accepted. He has a beautiful home in Saint-Germain-du-Pré in Paris. You can visit it. It's a museum today. He was successful and his home was quite magnificent. All right, liberty leading the people, the personification of the revolution. Now, this is, of course, the revolution I mentioned, the first revolution, 1789 to 1799, has already occurred, obviously, and now it's 1830. So the 1830 revolution was Louis Philippe was put in power. They deposed Charles X. And Louis Philippe, as you can look at some of Daumier's cartoons called Gargantuan, showing Louis Philippe was, talk about corrupt. I mean, he was being paid so much. So eventually he gets toppled too, but that's quite a bit later. So let's just focus on the painting. So liberty again personifies victory, leading the people. Liberty leading the people. And she holds the tricolor, the French colors, and you saw all manner of French citizens participating in this revolution. And it's not just the everyday people who are gaining control and support in France at this time, moving away from the aristocracy. And we have everything from actual rather aristocratic attire, this man here, and we just all manner of dress. And it's a very gruesome scene. We see dead bodies on the diagonal. You see the smoke as it kind of spewing around the figures, gives it an element of mystery. We have this Parliament building and just all the people lined up in the back. But so the French tricolor, the diagonal, she's liberty, she's leading the people, and in this wonderful, powerful pose. And just this is probably considered his magnus opus. Again, because of time, I'm going to move on. The death of Sardanapalus actually was a tale of a Syrian king, and it was inspired by the poet Byron, who wrote a play of the same name. So it had a lot of inspiration from romantic literature and history from the past. And so it shows this interest in the exotic. Remember, people are traveling more and more. They're going to places like the Middle East, Morocco, Tangiers. They're also going to Asia, and particularly the Impressionists were interested in Asian, Japanese art for very prominently. But Sardanapalus, who was he? He was a Syrian king, a nasty, horrible man. And what does he do? His enemies are coming to surround his palace. And instead of fleeing or doing something noble, he's ignoble. He's the antithesis of Neoclassicism, of both of the Heratai, showing force and strength and courage, weakness and gluttony. So what he's doing here on this marvelous diagonal red bed, he's watching his retinue, his concubines being murdered, and his animals, his prized horse is being stabbed, and people are dying. Only one woman faces us in the throes of death. You see all manner of jewelry and gold. We see a servant with a hewer with water or wine. And then we have swords and daggers, and we don't know quite what's happening here. And then, of course, he just looks sort of a banal look on his face. And then we have, you see this elephants here. But so it comes from literature. He's draped in this fabric. It's on the diagonal. It shows the rich colors that Delacroix favored. So we have to move on, and we will go to a new movement. That's called realism. So realism shows the evolution of French society. As this was done, a couple things happened. Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels were writing 1848. So this definitely, and Courbet was a socialist. He was actually in prison for a time of socialist leanings. And they were interested in democratic reform and showing everyday people. They were tired of showing the aristocrats and, all these things. They wanted to show the everyday people who were the workers and the people who kept the society going. These are modern subjects, working class people. And it really starts with Gustave Courbet, this great artist. He loved landscape. He lived in Normandy for a while. And so he had this great understanding of landscape painting. And he also reflects the change being brought on by the Industrial Revolution in France. Industrial Revolution in France really doesn't take hold till about 1859, 1850, excuse me. So this is on the cusp, but things are starting to evolve. It's really about 1870 that France really fully in the Industrial Revolution. So 1830 and then 1848 were the catalysts with the revolutions. Now, the burial of Ornans was quite interesting because he was raised in Ornans near Normandy, and he challenged the conventions of academic art. He did have connection to Académie de Beaux-Arts, but he didn't want to do mythology and history paintings. He wanted to do paintings of the people, pardon me. So he paints his uncle's burial. This is his own uncle in Ornans, and you see everyday people. And it shows the movement toward modern art. It also shows the dignity of everyday people. He infuses them with dignity. And so this is his village, his where he grew up. His uncle is being buried. We always have to have a little memento mori, a skull indicates obviously death, a reminder of our passing. And this is sort of a beautiful crucifix here, which is saying we're all equal under the eyes of God. Sort of interesting. And then we have the clergy and all manner of people. And you notice that everybody's at the same level, purposefully. And except for the crucifix, the sky is unaltered. So, pardon me. So the sky is unaltered, but you see the peasants in very somber clothes, monochromatic, except for the red of clergy here, or supporters of the clergy. Here's the priest. But it really heralds, and then of course the open pit for the grave. So it's quite a magnificent painting, and one that reflects his own life. This is, to me, this painting fascinates me. Why? It fascinates me because it no longer exists. And I had a huge discussion with a friend of mine, and I hope she's listening, Judy. Hi, Judy. And she was talking about, she was very interested in a program she saw on reparation of art, the theft of art, the destruction of art that was recently not only publicized, but it was on, I think it was 60 Minutes. And they talk about things that have happened to art, whether it's stolen from countries or destroyed because of war. And this happened to be housed in Dresden during World War II, and it was destroyed during a bombing. Pretty horrible story. But let's go on. So this is such an interesting painting. We've got these two men who are called stone breakers. Now, stone breaking is what they use for chain gangs, or today they would use big, excavators that would come in. You don't see people hacking at stone. This is terrible, laborious, backbreaking, stone breaking. But we have a young boy in very tattered clothes, and a man who's probably too old for the work, and they're hacking at these stones, and they're being shown as imprisoned people because of everything is in this cave-like setting, and we have just little glimmer of blue light. So it doesn't give you much of escape. And so you see the positions, they're very poor, and they're very, they're noble, but they're sacrificing, and they're tattered clothes. There's nothing fun about this situation. Later, I'm going to show you a work by Millet very shortly, and that shows a little bit of more of a noble, and not to say that he doesn't consider, Courbet doesn't consider these men noble, but we see it in a more, let's say, acceptable, prettier surroundings. And I'll just show you that in just a minute. Okay, so this, compare it to the work by Jean-François Millet, who did participate in the Barbizon School. He too was from the area of Normandy. His father were farmers, but he was steeped in Latin and literature because they had money and they educated him. He was an early pupil of Antoine Gericault, and he moved to Paris. He did study at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was a student of Paul Delaroche, so he had really great credentials. He was a very good portrait painter. He wasn't really accepted at first to the salons, but eventually he did because people realized what a great painter he was. Okay, so let's just look really carefully at the Gleaners. The Gleaners, some people say like the Three Graces, not exactly. Gleaners are at the lowest rung of society, and what they're doing is they're taking the shafts of wheat that fall after the harvest, and they just take the dregs, the detritus. And here you see, vast bales of hay, and this is a very successful harvest. As I say, Industrial Revolution is starting to occur outside, and they're harvesting a little more successfully. And we've got people, they're probably wealthy people because they've got guards and hay wains and everything. And these women are bending over, but they're noble, and the light is beautiful, and the landscape is exquisite. So he wanted to, the beautiful sunlight, he wanted to show nobility in the fact that people work hard and they, it's not just the nobility that needed to be recognized. So I would love to spend more time. It's one of my favorite paintings, but we will go on. So Henri Daumier was an amazing artist. People always say he was just a caricaturist and did cartoons, but he was a sculptor, a painter, lithographer. And he was from Marseille, and he was probably the most well-known social political commentator. He was jailed for a time, as I said, this gargantuan, making fun of the monarch. He got in a lot of trouble for that. He always criticized, very sardonic, criticized the upper classes, never the poor. He found them noble, and he showed them with great sympathy. In Third Class Carriage, I believe there's 3 examples. We're going to talk about the one in the Met. And what it shows is the beating down of people with poverty, because, these carriages in wintertime were freezing cold, third class, bare seats, wooden plank, no heat. And these 2 women are huddled with, the older woman, probably the grandmother, the mother with the baby at her breast, and this young child. You notice no men are with them. And the people behind seem to have more money. Maybe that's the second class start. He's got a little bit of a top hat and they're a little better dressed, but these people probably, sack of potatoes kind of thing. It's cramped, it's sturdy. It's not a noble situation. So he looked up some of the work of Daumier, because one thing I did find interesting is I didn't realize he was a sculptor, or that he was known for being really multimedia artist, but suffice to say, he made important criticisms. All right, so now we're going to go into, because I know Impressionism is important to people, and I do want to make sure we have some time for that. Theodore Rousseau was really one of the Barbizon painters, and a Barbizon is outside of the Fontainebleau, and they were the predecessors to the Impressionists. But they were connected more to realism. We just looked at realist painting. They were the landscape painters of realism. Where Daumier and Gericault and Courbet and Millet were the painting more of the people. He did a lot of the landscape. So there's a gentleness of the brushstroke. It's plein air, a little more realistic than the Impressionists. Who were the great painters? Corot, Rousseau, Daumier, and they were painting outside of the Barbizon woods. So Theodore Rousseau, he was born in Paris, a bourgeois family, showed an aptitude for art, showed it early in the salon. But in 1848, he took up residence in the Barbizon woods. And like Courbet, he loved the outdoors. I forgot to mention that. Courbet was a great hiker, naturalist, and so was Rousseau. And so he paints this beautiful birches. And you see a priest on a horse here, and you see the light. It's autumn, and the light is falling on the trees. And he was one of the leaders of the Barbizon school, and the autumn leaves are falling. The light is soft and exquisite. And you can see, in a few minutes, we'll look at a landscape by an Impressionist, you will see a great source of inspiration. One of the greatest artists, and we do have a wonderful Corot in the Timken, and in fact, I'm just going to skip to the next painting just because of time. I want to talk about our Timken painting, and this is called The View of Volterra. So Corot sort of transcended all the movements. I mean, he was a little bit of a romantic painter, a little bit of a realistic painter, a landscape painter, but he was such a brilliant man. I mean, he was, when we look at post-impressionists, we identify it because the great Van Gogh, for example, was so independent in his thinking that we had to almost think of a new movement as a result of his work. Same with Cézanne, same with Picasso. Corot was kind of like that. He was so talented. He loved to travel to Italy. He would sometimes just lie on his back and sketch. And he went to this 14th century town called Volterra. This painting in the Timken was so inspirational to me that I had to go to Volterra outside of Florence in the Tuscan countryside just to see the town. Because it's also, you can see these medieval fortresses, but it's also where Etruscan and Roman ruins are located. So come to see this painting. It shows his gift at landscape. He would go sketch outside, whether he's in Italy or France, and then obviously come back and do some pretty large paintings. So this, of course, is in our very own Timken. Now, perhaps in my mind, one of the greatest artists of the 19th century and past several hundred years was probably really pivotal in the idea of modernism. So Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe was considered one of the first Impressionist paintings, although not exactly, because Impressionism really is 1874 Impressionist movement, but he worked with the Impressionists. He knew Monet and Pissarro and all these artists, but his style was independent. He was very steeped in the art of, like, Velázquez, for example, and Goya. He loved the dark sort of tenebrism of the Spanish painters. And Impressionism, I just will say, is going outdoors, it's spontaneity, it's plein air, it's experimenting with brushstroke and color, light and atmosphere, observation of nature, really important. So Monet, Manet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, each one a little bit different. So let's talk about this monumental, probably one of the first modernist painting, Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, Luncheon on the Grass. He called it his own, let's see, there's a French term, pattes carrées, which means like this is four squares or four people. There was a funny name he used to call it because he looked at a work by Giorgione. It's called Concert Champêtre, sorry, it's the COVID. And it was an outdoor luncheon, and he was inspired by that. But this is quite unique because here, it was very shocking to people, very shocking. And here we have a nude woman and a partially clothed woman, and we have two men. And one man, I believe the one with the fez, is his brother-in-law, who's a Dutch sculptor. And then this one is a composite of his brother Eugene and another brother. So this is Manet's own brothers. They came from a wealthy family. And it's in a very shallow space, but you have these beautiful dappled trees. And we have a still life. So this is landscape, still life in figuration. Quite remarkable. And just the whole premise of this just is such a break from what has been captured before in art. One other thing I'll say is it does look more like a studio painting, though. I mean, even though we have a boat here and the water and she's bathing and it's landscape, but the shallow space and the way it's depicted kind of looks like more of a studio. Not as a disparaging comment, just as a point of fact. All right. So, bar the Folies Bergère. The Impressionists not only did landscape painting, and we're going to look at Pissarro and Monet quickly, who were really the fathers, but Manet was, as I say, a wealthy man. He was very interested, like Degas, in the people as well as the landscape. So this is his last painting. He was dying. And the Bar de Folies Bergère, quite interesting. It was a nightclub. And the woman here, Suzanne, is the bartender, but she's also a prostitute. And you know that because of this dish of oranges. That was known as, one of my professors at UCLA, Timothy Clark, said that the oranges relates to the thought of prostitution. Another couple things, the Franco-Prussian War had ended 10 years prior, and they were angry. They were not showing German beer. It's British beer here. That's a Bass thing. Then we have this magnificent mirror, and it's been inspired by Velázquez because, as I mentioned, he was a great student of 17th century Spanish Baroque. We have a trapeze artist because all manner of activities happening. So the mirror he took from Las Meninas, and here's the feet, and then this chandelier. And then what is happening? He studied photography just like Degas. These, photography had been around now for about more than 60 years. You know, we think Henry Fox Talbot and Daguerre are already full throttle, and photography is, you know, very dominating a lot. But this beautiful woman with the flowers, she's talking to someone, and I can't see on my screen, but there's a man, I hope you can see it, in the foreground, I mean, in the background of the painting here, and it looks like he's talking to her, but it's not the same reflection. So there's this play on perspective that is quite remarkable, but not 100% understood. All right, I have to talk about Impression Sunrise. So in 1872, Claude Monet, the father of Impressionism, he was from Paris. He then moved to, he lived in Le Havre. His family actually lived in England because of the Franco-Prussian War. They fled France, which was good because a lot of people were getting killed around that time. So he lived in England. So when you look at his multiple paintings of the Thames, for example, the Parliament House, it was because he was interested in painting things in repetition, haystacks, water lilies, the Thames, Parliament buildings. You would see that, but some of them are from British subjects, and that's because he lived there. His father worked in the shipping industry, kind of at a low level, supplies. And so he knew that Le Havre. He was actually very proud too of the fact the industrialization of France and Le Havre, you know, the shipping industry was very prominent there. So he had a firsthand view of that. Okay, so he was a leader. He moved eventually to Giverny. I'm going to show you in just a minute. Impression Sunrise was called that because these artists, 13 of them went, I believe it was 13, they decided to, no salon doesn't want us, let's do the salon de refusé. And at that salon, a critic said, oh, these are like impressionists. These aren't really paintings. So it was a derogatory term that stuck. But it is impression. It's gestural brushstroke. It's light. It's boats. It's light on the water. Boats in the harbor. It's diffuse. It's beautiful. And this is considered the first truly French Impressionist painting. You know, I mentioned that with Desjardins, that was building up. And here we have its sort of the first one. Okay, Giverny, a beautiful place to visit. I've been very lucky to have visited there in the fall many years ago. And if you've visited, you know it's beautiful. And Giverny was inspired by his interest in Japanese art. Woodblock prints were piling into France and other places. He was an avid gardener. He took 10 years to create this using aquatic plants, Asian aquatic plants. In fact, his neighbors were like horrified because, well, these plants are not indigenous species, but he prevailed and he built this beautiful place with a bridge, a Japanese bridge. And look at this, is sort of really exemplifies his work. Outdoors, light colors, diffuse. Remember, he suffered from glaucoma toward the end of his life and was not able to really paint more detail, but he didn't really want to. He really didn't want to. Okay, another person considered one of the fathers, because he was the oldest, is Camille Pissarro, who's an unusual guy. He was part Danish, part Portuguese. He was Jewish. There's a lot of anti-Semitism. In fact, even from Degas, his own art companion, so to speak. He was raised on a Caribbean island. He loved nature, actually lived in Venezuela. Really interesting guy. But he was one of the people who painted more the cities rather than the outdoors so much. He did a lot of the cityscapes. And this is, of course, Montmartre at night. And many of you have visited Montmartre. It's a very dynamic place. And this is dynamic. Look at it's not, he did study Seurat and Signac and pointillism. This has an element of pointillism in it, but of the series that he did of Paris, this is only night painting, and to me it's his most successful, quite beautiful. So you see it's diffused, the rain has happened, it's moist, it's beautiful, typical Impressionist painting. And here he did the Crystal Palace. What's kind of interesting about the Crystal Palace is it was built for a World's Fair, I believe, and it was for it was in excuse me, I'm just kind of a little mental blank. It was supposed to be exhibited for a number of years, but it only lasted about 2 years in Hyde Park, and then it was taken to another place where it was here that he painted this, and it was The place was Sydenham, and so that's why we have the Crystal Palace, not in Hyde Park, but it just shows people along the quay and the diffused light and the brushstrokes and outdoors and plein air. So quite a typical Impressionist painting. And I do want to go to Degas really quickly. And Degas came from an aristocratic family. We know that DE in French is like Von. But he was different. He was associated with the Impressionists and he did exhibit with them at times, but he was interested in the cafes, the ballet. You can see in some of his sculptures, the races, and he shows a ballet master with 24 pupils. And he too was influenced by photography because you can see this perspective, these 24 girls, it's the dance master. And some of them are beautiful and elegant, and some of them are like, this girl's a little flat-footed. We have a little dog here watching them all. But this building actually had burned down, I think, a year before, and either was rebuilt or something occurred. All right, I do want to go. This is quite a masterpiece. This is The Absinthe Drinker, and by Degas. And Degas, and I see Haley's there, so I'm just going to really quickly talk about this, and then we'll move on to questions. The Absinthe Drinker shows not necessarily a social commentary. Yes and no. Absinthe, as you might know, is pure alcohol. And a lot of people were succumbing to alcoholism and death because of this very strong liquor. And some people say that they still sell it in France. I guess that's the case. I don't know. I never looked for it. But so strong that people were just becoming raging alcoholics. And he's not saying don't drink absinthe or drink absinthe. What he's saying is people are alienated, people are isolated. So he shows these two people side by side, not interacting. She's a little more upscale than he because she's dressed more elegantly, and he looks quite rough, as they say. And it is, again, a social comment, but not exactly about alcoholism, but you can read into it what you like. So the last painting I'm going to show you, just depending on any, is The Luncheon at the Boating Party by Renoir. So let's just first see if anybody has any questions, and if we have a minute, I'll talk about this, but you can marvel at this magnus opus of Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Haley, how are we doing with any questions?
So far, I don't have any questions in the chat. So if you want to talk about this painting.
Oh, sure. Okay. In the minute I have left, I like to use my time. All right. So Renoir was known for a little bit of, I don't know if obsession is a word, but he's really interested in sort of the female form and beauty and, elegance. He uses a very soft and wonderful palette. He often talks a lot about the people that he interacted with. He started as a Limoges painter. He grew up in Limoges, and he started as a porcelain painter and sort of honed his skills there. He studied with Charles Gleyre in Paris. There he met Sisley and Basile and Monet, and he participated in the first Salon exhibition, 1868, and then later Impressionist exhibition. So here he has friends of his. Right here is his soon-to-be married, his fiancée. And I believe this is the owner of the restaurant. Here we have Caillebotte, a French painter. We have one of Renoir's models. We have Charles Ephusus, who was a wealthy publisher and contributor and a collector of Renoir. And we have this magnificent atmosphere. And again, it shows a quality of art that these artists could, manufacture. I mean, it's a lovely still life, a sweet landscape, and great figurative painter. And I love the way he sort of puts them all so close together, close friends, as they interact on a beautiful spring or summer day. So I'll end with this. I'm sorry, it's a little bit rushed. And I do want to say that the next lecture in July, I will go into the work of the post-impressionists, maybe cover for a few minutes a little bit more of Impressionism, and then show how it segues into post-impressionism. Again, Haley, any more any questions or?
No questions, but two comments just saying that that you did a great job on your presentation and that they can't imagine what it's like learning from you when you're not under the weather.
What a sweet comment. Well, I really appreciate, I do have quite a dedication to these lectures, and I just felt that I could go on, and I hopefully I did a decent job, and I enjoyed doing it. So I hope you learned something, and I was so glad you could all tune in, and I hope to see you next month on Post-Impressionism. And Haley, thank you. You're always wonderful for hosting, and also Scott, another employee of the Timken. So without further ado, I will close and have a great day, everybody. And Haley, again, thank you so much.
Thank you all again for coming. And if you would like to see any other lectures, they can be found on our Facebook page. So thank you again, Karen, for that wonderful tour, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you very much. I guess I can leave the meeting.